as Mara says, I have a book that's reaching the final stages of production, and then it disappears off to the publishers. And I'm going to talk initially about some of the broad themes that I want to develop in the book, and then bring them to bear upon a particular case study, which is about these cows in the Netherlands. But the broad theme of the book is around the Anthropocene, this proposal by geologists that the planet has entered a new epoch, and I'll say some more about the Anthropocene, and then what that might mean for Western environmentalism in general, which for a long time has been concerned with a certain idea about nature. So I'll talk a little bit about the Anthropocene concept and then reflect on some of its implications for wildlife conservation in particular. Some of you will have been here to hear Noel Castry talk about the Anthropocene last year. I've been fortunate enough to see what Noel had to say through the video link, so I'll try not to duplicate too much about what Noel was talking about in relation to the Anthropocene. Who's come across the term the Anthropocene to date? Okay, so there's a fair number of people here who are aware of the concept. It was on the front cover of The Economist. The Economist dedicated a special edition to the Anthropocene back in 2011. Broadly speaking, it's a concept put forward by a collection of geologists, particularly Paul Crutzen, who's a Nobel Prize-winning geologist, published a paper in 2002 in Nature, suggesting that the magnitude of human impacts was such that geologists would find enough evidence to qualify the planet as moving into a different epoch. So geologists divide up historical time into epochs. This is a broad sketch of the kind of orthodoxy of epochs at the moment, and we're right down the bottom here. We've lost the bottom end of the slide here. But a sense that the Holocene, which began 10,000 years ago, there's a magnitude of change significant enough that the planet has come out of the Holocene into the Anthropocene, and this is obviously a significant thing for geology. But the concept has begun to travel more widely. So it's traveled to The Economist, it's traveled into other circles of policy and science, and it's becoming almost a catch-all term for environmental change. The Anthropocene is almost subsuming various terms that were there previously to describe environmental change. Now, of course, the Anthropocene doesn't describe the final domestication of the planet. This isn't a success story. It's not that humans have finally become the god species, tamed the earth, and rationally organized everything in the interests of our own security. As the IPCC reminds us, the Anthropocene describes a period of crisis. It's a period of alarming predictions about the changing nature of the climate, discussions about planetary boundaries, certain thresholds that are being crossed. Okay. It's also a very radical concept. Some people writing about the Anthropocene suggest it's as radical a concept, at least in popular culture, as Charles Darwin's theories about science of evolution of natural selection. Okay? A sense that in certain circles there is some anxiety about thinking about humans as geological actors. The idea that we have the power to change the planet is not something that many cultures are disposed to think of humans as having the power to do. And as a consequence, it's been received with a fair amount of resistance in the same way as Darwin's ideas were historically and continue to be in certain influential parts, particularly of the US, but also elsewhere. A sense that in some ways the public might prefer a reassuring lie to the inconvenient truth about the Anthropocene. Okay, so it's a controversial concept. We're aware of debates about climate change denial. This is by no means something that is likely to be received in an uncontroversial fashion. The broad constituency who interests me for this talk are environmentalists. So environmentalists, you would have thought, would have less problem with the Anthropocene. They'd have less problem with the idea that humans change the planet. For some time now, environmentalists have been telling us about local impacts. Okay, so this is an advert from WWF. We've lost the logo down the bottom here. A broad kind of visual vernacular. Here we have Tarzan swinging through what I think we're taking to be the rainforest, encountering a clear cut with all the evidence of the depredations of modern industrial society in the background. A sense that environmentalism have talked about local impacts upon nature in various locations. There's a familiar discourse here about nature being threatened by human impact. What I'd argue is different about the Anthropocene is it argues that nature anywhere in the world has come to an end. There aren't these pure places left that we could draw lines around to designate as natural. And this will be a familiar argument to many of you who've encountered work like Bill McKibben and other geographers. But for many environmentalists, for many conservationists, this is proving quite challenging. So the Anthropocene, the planet has entered a new epoch because of the magnitude of human impacts, suggests that there isn't any nature left. There's nowhere left we could draw lines around and say, that is natural, we can keep it in perpetuity in that fashion, and we will somehow be saving the world. Because everywhere, from the bottom of the deep sea oceans to the upper atmosphere, now bears some signature of human impacts. The places that David Attenborough takes us to with consistent frequency on Monday nights and other nights through the Natural World series don't exist as nature according to the visual vernacular that we are, particularly in Western viewing public, steeped in. This idea of places without people, places that we might visit, places that we might save, and in whose saving we will secure the future of the planet. Okay, so one of the big challenges for environmentalists is a sense that this thing called nature that we've been so preoccupied about doesn't exist anymore. Okay, so there's a kind of ontological challenge. There's a challenge about the materiality of the stuff that we're anxious about. It doesn't exist anymore in the Anthropocene. And instead now environmentalists talk about this idea of novel ecosystems. Okay, so unprecedented ecological assemblages that are coming into existence by virtue of climate change, by virtue of the traffic in species through human trade and subsequent invasion. Okay, so there's a really interesting body of ecological science emerging, developing this idea of novel ecosystems, so non-analog systems that have come about partly as a result of human impacts upon the planet. Okay, so we've got a very different concept of what the non-human world is. It's not nature anymore. It's not a kind of pure place that you can divide off from society. It's novel. It's unprecedented. It's non-analog. It's assembled through various forms of human activity. Okay, so one of the challenges is to start to recalibrate conservation, recalibrate environmentalism, where there isn't some pure, fixed, timeless historical benchmark that we can go back to. It becomes much more about living in inhabited landscapes where people are significant ecological actors and where things are changing at unprecedented rates. Okay, so that's one of the big challenges for environmentalism, at least for conservation in the Anthropocene. The second issue I want to talk about briefly is the relationship between science and politics. Okay, so conservation biology came into existence as a crisis discipline. It was a discipline bent on saving species from extinction, saving particular places from extinction, often geared around drawing lines on the map to lock down particular locations as nature. And it was premised to a certain extent on a familiar modern understanding of science as objective, as removed from society, the provider of facts in the belief that politicians would act rationally, informed by those facts to create informed policy. And people will recognize that diagram from an account, a certain caricatured account of the relationship between science and politics that Latour offers in his work on the politics of nature. And here is E.O. Wilson, who's a great believer in the power of reason, the power of science to make people behave in a rational and informed fashion. But as we know, nature is an incredibly political category. You know, science has failed, by and large, to provide the universal objective benchmark against which we might hold politics to account, provide a universal framework for governing the environment. Instead, we have this proliferation of controversies around what nature is, the politics of nature, badger culling, energy policy, animal testing, GM. Many of you are working on these kind of topics. A sense that science and politics are fundamentally entangled in the Anthropocene. There's both a sense that science is complicit in generating many of the processes that are driving planetary destruction, but at the same time, environmentalists put great faith in certain forms of science to save us from disaster. So there's this kind of ambivalent relationship with science, a sense we need science, but we need to bring science into politics in new ways to hold scientists to account and to provide the types of knowledge we need for tackling environmental problems. This reaches its kind of extreme form in various forms of climate change skepticism, climate denial, which in many ways we see deploying the very techniques crafted by social constructivists to undermine the authority of science or to question the credibility of science, push back against science that many of us would quite like to see having a certain leverage in policy domains. So this is a screen grab from Fox News with some probably slightly dubious poll about what people think is truthful in relation to climate, or the Daily Express, that reputable scientific publication, deploying science or questioning the integrity of science in ways that many of us would find quite alarming. So in a sense, there's a mess. There's a mix here where science is by no means held to be outside of politics, providing us with objective facts that will tackle these issues. Now, these are all broad questions that have been explored by geographers, by sociologists of science for some time now. Many of these themes will be familiar. Many of these themes, for me, in some ways, anticipate the diagnosis of the Anthropocene. I reckon a lot of us have been working on this well in advance of some of the popular discussion about the Anthropocene and what it means for social science, what it means for the relationship between science and politics. And like Noel Castry, I think there's and this is, I guess, Noel's most recent book here, a sense of an opportunity. There's an opportunity here for intellectual endeavor. There's also an opportunity for geographers and other social scientists who've been developing ideas to bring this knowledge to bear upon the contemporary political juncture. Okay, so a more optimistic take on the Anthropocene might be that it's an opportunity. There's a political opportunity, and the event of the diagnosis of the Anthropocene offers an opportunity for us to think about environmentalism differently, to think about how we do environmental thought and practice differently in this particularly kind of hot situation where the concept is being debated and is traveling. Okay, so that would be a broad preamble, a sense that in some ways the Anthropocene requires us to think differently about the stuff of the world, these kind of models of nature, ontologies of what we think the world is. It requires us to think a little bit differently about the relationship between science and politics, and also about the types of science that we do if we can't make recourse to a nature that's fixed and timeless. Okay, so there's a context here, there's an event that's taken place, which provides a really interesting opportunity for environmental thought to do things differently. Okay, so that would be my preamble. That's my kind of hypothesis for what I think we could usefully do with the Anthropocene. In many ways, it's a disaster. But in many ways, it's also an opportunity for us academics engaged in these debates to contribute something useful. So in the remainder of the talk, I want to try and illustrate this through the emergence of a particular way of doing wildlife conservation, which has come to be known as rewilding, and to try and think through those broad themes about the stuff of nature, the type of science that gets done, and the relationship between science and politics through this particular model of nature conservation. Who's come across rewilding before? Okay, good. Many of you will have come across it through George Monbiot's recent book and its sort of serialization and very successful publicity work in the Guardian and elsewhere. Emma Maris is a science writer for Nature magazine and writes a really, for me, compelling account of the emergence of novel ecosystem science and travels the world drawing on case studies of how conservationists are perhaps thinking a little bit more optimistically about novel ecosystems and ecology. And she develops this very nice notion of the rambunctious garden as a kind of metaphor for how she thinks about the planet. Broadly speaking, rewilding tries to move away from a model of conservation that's premised on saving individual species, preserving the composition of existing ecologies, to try and restore processes into ecologies, particularly trying to work out what processes would have been significant in the past and either try to reinstigate them through bringing back herbivores or large carnivores, or through thinking creatively about how you might use surrogate species if the predecessor was extinct to kickstart the process. So one of the most famous examples would be the wolves in Yosemite, I think, or in Yellowstone, where wolves had gone extinct. They reintroduced the wolves. There was a lot of excitement about the wolf, but the wolf was much more interesting because of the trophic effects it had upon the wider food chain. So the presence of the wolf creates this ecology of fear, and the herbivores graze differently, so you get different vegetation dynamics, and a wider sense that the wolf is is very significant as the instigator of ecological processes as much as it is as a charismatic animal in that way. Okay, so there's a shift in the ontology, really, of what we think conservation is about. It's much less about preserving distributions and numbers of existing species, and much more about large-scale, process-based interventions. I want to provide an illustration of rewilding through a case study in the Netherlands, and this will hopefully bring out how this is quite radical, maybe some of its promises as well as some of its challenges. The Oostvaardersplassen, which is a polder landscape in the Netherlands, has emerged as a kind of flagship example of this model of conservation. Has anybody been to the Oostvaardersplassen? Okay. Anybody heard of it but not been there? Okay. So it's a spectacular place. The advocates for it want us to imagine it as this Serengeti behind the dikes. Okay, if you can imagine Serengeti, BBC Africa, behind the dikes, in the Netherlands. And for them, that's not a paradox. That's not a contradiction. You could have large numbers of charismatic, large animals in a suburban landscape just north of Amsterdam. Okay, so this is where we are. Polder landscape on the Flevoland, which is a large province reclaimed from the sea after the Second World War. I think it is still the largest artificial island in the world. We can kind of zoom in. So this is where we're headed, this site here. So you've got Amsterdam. This is all kind of commuterville, agricultural land. There's a railway line that runs through it. You start to get a sense of what the ecology is like. So it's partly flooded, partly open, very fertile grassland. And this is the site here. So it's about 5,000 hectares. It was originally reclaimed for industrial use, but the drainage proved so difficult that it was never actually developed, and it was abandoned by and large. They developed around it. This is some of the most fertile agricultural land in Europe. Just here, these are commuter towns either side of the Oostvaardersplassen. Epic amounts of engineering nous that went into both creating it and keeping it above sea level. I mean, this would all be underwater if it wasn't for some very sophisticated hydraulics, flood control, and all the rest of it. But the site was abandoned, or at least never developed, and it was gradually colonized initially by a set of migratory birds and then by some geese. And it caught the attention of a very charismatic Dutch ecologist, Frans Vera, who worked for Staatsbosbeheer, which is the Dutch equivalent of the kind of English Nature, Natural England, and the Forestry Commission. They're kind of the statutory organization responsible for managing the site. And Vera got very interested in this site and the way in which the geese in particular were keeping it open. So the orthodox theory of European ecology would suggest that this would gradually, through a process of succession, return to a high forest. And he became interested in the role of these herbivores, the geese, in keeping the site open. And he developed this hypothesis that actually these large herbivores had a much more significant role to play in the history of European landscapes than we tend to think. And he suggests that rather than the dominant climax ecology of Europe being the high forest, it would be more of an open, shifting mosaic of forest and pasture landscapes. And he did his PhD and he wrote this up in this book, which has proved to be very controversial in both conservation and scientific circles, because it asks some pretty serious questions about European conservation policy, which is largely about subsidizing low-intensity farming. So the orthodoxy in Europe is that the farmers keep the forest open and they generate biodiversity. And without the farmers, you'd have forest and that would be bad for biodiversity. It's a bit of a caricature. Vera says that's nonsense. Biodiversity survived despite farming, and actually we should stop subsidizing low-intensity farming. We should let the forest return to an open, dynamic landscape with these large herbivores. So to try and test this hypothesis, he got hold of a load of large cows and horses, selected for their hardiness. So these are heck cattle, which are there as surrogates for the aurochs. So the aurochs is the antecedent to all domestic cattle, now extinct. But they're there to replicate the ecological functions of the aurochs. And conic ponies, which are a similar surrogate for the tarpan, which is the wild horse that is also now extinct. and some red deer were also introduced and confined within this 5,000 hectare reserve. And the idea was that they would be left to their own devices. They would in some ways run an experiment to see whether or not Vera's hypothesis about the shifting mosaic forest pasture landscapes was an accurate description of what was going on in Europe. So if you visit there now, it's spectacular. There are these big herds of cattle and horses. There's a lot of them, and I'll talk about why that's become controversial. And if you kind of squint a bit and you cut out the wind turbines and the industrial infrastructure, you could perhaps convince yourself that it is a certain form of the Serengeti behind the dikes. The ecology is fascinating. It'd be fair to say it's not proved Vera's hypothesis. Many people think that it's nonsense to begin with, but it has thrown up a whole series of quite surprising ecological events that nobody would have anticipated. So sea eagles now nest on the site below sea level. So, ecologists said you never get any sea eagles here. It's all below sea level. Sea eagles are never going to come and arrive. Vera said, we'll try, and they built these nesting platforms for the sea eagles, and they ignored them, and they went and built their own nesting platforms in these sort of shrubs below sea level. Okay, so you've got this kind of surprising ecology. Vultures turned up. They never had vultures in the Netherlands before, at least for a long time. You've got lots of dead animal flesh around the place, so you've got very interesting invertebrate flora and fauna, lots of kind of dynamics and processes which haven't been witnessed previously, as well as all sorts of interesting animal behavior to do with these cattle and horses that have been allowed to kind of find their way in various ways. So it's become inadvertently a very interesting scientific site, not perhaps for the reasons that Vera would have us believe, but it's had these kind of spin-offs. It's inspired a fairly effective political movement lobbying in Brussels to try and rewild Europe, as they call it, and this is this maybe somewhat problematic imagination they have of what Europe might be like. They're particularly interested in the common agricultural policy, particularly interested in trying to, in some ways, encourage land abandonment in areas of Eastern Europe where they see the kind of low-hanging fruit for this type of rewilding. You could stick the large herbivores in there rather than continuing to pay people to farm in a way that they think is ecologically not particularly beneficial. And as you can imagine, people who live in marginal areas of the Iberian Peninsula or in parts of Eastern Europe aren't particularly happy with this imagination of what the future holds for them, but they've been quite effectively lobbying in Brussels to try and bring about this vision of a new Europe. So it's an emerging paradigm of conservation which is gaining a fair amount of traction. George Monbiot has given it a fair amount of publicity in the UK. I don't think he'd go the kind of whole hog of what they're imagining here, but in a sense it's gathering momentum, and Vera's experiment is often held up as an iconic site that people could visit to see how you could do this in the Netherlands, in the suburbs of Amsterdam. But it has proved very controversial, particularly the welfare issues around leaving herds of formerly domesticated animals to die in the winter. And I'll say a bit more about that. But there's been a series of international commissions assembled by the Dutch government to try and arrive at a solution to this, a kind of science-led solution to what might be done about the site. And it continues to surface as a political problem, particularly in harsh winters when the animals starve. Okay, so that's the case study. What could we draw from this experiment in relation to the broader themes that I'm trying to develop in this talk, about ideas about nature, about the types of science that we need for the Anthropocene, about the relationships that get done between science and politics. And in the written version of this paper, which was published in Transactions a few months ago, we explore these through these three axes of inquiry, thinking about the world as either found or made, thinking about science in relation to its relationships to surprises, whether you're just perpetuating the same or you're open to surprises. And then we develop Michel Callon's notion of politics being done in secluded sites or in the wild. I'll say a bit more about those, but for those of you who want to get into those analytics, the written version has a much longer section on those. But broadly speaking, if we're starting to think about what is nature at the Oostvaardersplassen, we found it quite useful to think about the relationship between lab and field sites and between places that are understood to be found and places that are understood to be made. Okay, so a lot of the status of the Serengeti is as a site that is found. It's a found site. You stumble upon it. It has limited evidence of human modification, and it's held up as natural. Okay. In contrast, the zoo is a manifestly made site. It's an artificial site. It's a laboratory almost, a site for experimentation. Maybe you wouldn't think about the zoo, but certainly in laboratory sites, there's very different norms of what's acceptable and understandable as nature in these different locations. So initially, Vera was quite happy to present the Oostvaardersplassen as a laboratory. This was a site for experimenting with nature. Okay. The Dutch have a much more kind of open idea about conservation. They're, I would suggest, much less concerned about replicating a past, and they will talk about nature development. They don't talk about nature conservation, they talk about nature development. And there's a whole idea that Oostvaardersplassen could be part of a larger infrastructure for nature. You could engineer nature in a way that isn't paradoxical. And a sense that Oostvaardersplassen could be part of a wider ecological network that could be designed and managed in the interests of ecology to bring wildlife back into the Netherlands. But at the same time, if this site was to be held up as an exemplar of nature in other areas of Europe, there had to be a sense that it wasn't dependent on humans, or that there had to be a sense that it downplayed the found status, or downplayed the made status and elevated the found status. If we want to accept this as a Serengeti, there has to be less of a sense of this as a kind of a power station or a dam, and more of this as a sense as a kind of a place that's spontaneously come into its own existence. So the narratives that you get are very much actually about the agency of the large herbivores. You know, we, the conservationists, unleashed these animals. We relieved them of their property rights, or we relieved ourselves of our property rights over them, and they've gone off and done their thing. And there's a sense that these are, in some ways, animals that you would find in the wild historically in order to generate these ecologies. But of course, for the animal welfareists, these aren't found animals. These are animals that have been introduced by conservationists, and they should be subject to the welfare requirements that we associate with animals in made settings, in farms, in laboratories, in zoos, etc. Analogies are drawn with concentration camps. There's a lot of publicity around the suffering and death of these animals during the winter, and lots of pressure put upon the Dutch government to feed them, to supplementary feed them in the winter. The conservationists resist this because they say it will change the behavior of the animals, it will undermine the integrity of the experiment, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. And the compromise that they've reached at the moment is this fascinating hybrid of the found and the made, which I think tells us some interesting stuff about how we might think about nature in the Anthropocene. So at the moment, there is a ranger who patrols the reserve, performing with the eye of the wolf a kind of predation policy. So he has a rifle, and he has to shoot animals that he thinks won't survive the winter, but guided by the logic of the wolf. Okay? And this is what the policy documents say. They talk about population control with the eye of the wolf, and the Dutch have a wonderful word for it that I can't pronounce, but you imagine it's a kind of wonderful amalgam of words put together. But of course, nobody knows how you assess the welfare of a wild cow, because we don't have wild cows. So they draw all the criteria for assessing the welfare of wild cows from agricultural settings. So you're sort of mapping criteria for assessing farm animal welfare onto the wild through a kind of human transmogrified wolf armed with a rifle who has to police the boundaries of what's acceptable. Okay. It's very Dutch. It's a wonderful kind of fudge. But for me, it's great. You know, it allows, in some ways, these animals to live a fairly flourishing life. They've discovered forms of being cow and being horse and being deer that would not otherwise be possible in agricultural landscapes in Europe. And death is fairly quick and fairly swift and fairly painless. So you've got this kind of hybrid, this mix, which isn't the Serengeti, but it's not a farm, and has allowed these kind of ecological relations to develop in various ways. So somewhere between the found and the made, you get this kind of interesting kind of version that's emerging. And in some ways, you could think about that, and Dutch ethicists have written some nice work about how you could generalize the ethics associated with that to map that onto other contexts where you're kind of grappling with these novel ecosystems, where you need these tools but the tools have ethical status, and you need to think about how you could deploy them in particular situations. Okay, so that would be something around what natures are in this situation. The second theme is about the science associated with this. Okay, so a lot of European conservation is caught up with a very static notion of what European ecology is. There's a certain fixed baseline associated with a certain set of habitats, largely associated with low-intensity farming that survived up to the beginning of the First World War. And these have become the criteria around which we assess what nature is in Europe. You can count the species, count the birds by and large. You can designate territories. And we have developed an incredibly sophisticated legal apparatus for saving these component parts of nature. And that informs a certain model of science, which is about monitoring, measuring, tracking the composition of a particular ecology. Now, within ecology, that framework has been strongly challenged by the rise of non-equilibrium approaches to ecology, which really dispute the idea of ecosystems having a single fixed equilibrium point. But that paradigm shift that's taken place in the science hasn't really moved out into policy circles. It's happening gradually, partly as a result of the rewilding stuff. But it struggles to account for the kind of anomalies that are interesting about the Oostvaardersplassen. Okay, so Natura 2000, which is the big framework that we use for governing wildlife in Europe, has no place for submarine sea eagles. Okay, it's just a kind of anomaly. There's no way you could anticipate that. You can't manage for those. There's probably bits of legislation that might require you to in some ways get rid of those things because they're not part of your management plan. Okay, so it's not very good at dealing with surprises. We're very good at imposing order onto landscapes for good political reasons, because there have been other people who want to change landscapes in fundamentally deleterious ways. But we're kind of caught up in a particular architecture for delivering nature, which is very bad at dealing with surprises. And what this model is about is in some ways letting the processes go, letting the cows do their thing to see what happens. But it's constrained by certain legal apparatuses and science associated with that makes it difficult for that to happen. So this came to a head at Oostvaardersplassen around the populations of spoonbills. So spoonbills are a rare European wader bird, of which there were a large number at the Oostvaardersplassen, and for which it had been designated as a special protection area and other sort of legal designations. And one year the spoonbills disappeared. There weren't any spoonbills. And the Dutch ornithologists were obviously very anxious about this. A lot of pressure was put upon Staatsbosbeheer, the Dutch agency. The argument was that these spoonbills were getting predated by the foxes that had turned up to eat the dead meat, and more should be done to control fox populations to, secure the future of spoonbills. Now, Vera would say, of course, foxes have been around forever. Spoonbills and foxes have co-evolved. You'd have movements of spoonbills elsewhere. And nothing was done, though there was a lot of legal wrangling to prevent anything being done. And it turned out the spoonbills had gone a few miles down the road and were at another site. But a sense that the Dutch conservation authorities were quite exposed because they didn't have a management plan. They weren't monitoring and surveying and providing management prescriptions in the quite detailed habitat requirements for spoonbills, let's say. There isn't a management plan for this site, which is, anybody who's worked in conservation is a very strange thing. There aren't targets. There aren't things that you could tick off to know that you were complying with your various designations. So there's a very different form of science required here, which is in some ways much more open-ended. It's much more open to surprises, to anomalous results, but it rubs up against some very hard-fought legal and epistemic efforts that have been developed in ecology over the last sort of 40, 50 years or so. Okay, and then thirdly, how might we think about the relationship between science and politics in this debate? And it's obviously a very niche case study. This is a very wealthy, democratic, Northern European country, and we want to be wary about mapping what we learn from this onto other parts of the world. But a broad sense about how we might think of the status of science in the debates that have taken place about the management of this site. And here it would be fair to say that although Staatsbosbeheer have been very happy to give agency to the cows and very happy to have very open-ended deliberations with their horses, they've been very wary about letting the public have any say in what's going on here. And in some ways, this is a classic example of a kind of authoritarian, science-led bureaucracy really not listening to local interests around what might happen in terms of the management of the site, particularly in relation to the animal welfare debates. And those of you who are familiar with debates between animal welfarists and conservationists and farmers will know how heated these things become quite quickly. So the international commissions that were assembled to kind of evaluate the way in which politics have been done here are fairly damning about the way in which Staatsbosbeheer, and particularly Franz Vera, who's not somebody who compromises very easily, dealt with the controversies that raged around this particular example. So this is an excerpt from their second report. And they say the management by Staatsbosbeheer, by the Dutch organization, is not strongly driven by research and monitoring outcomes. Okay, so it's not scientific enough. It has little stakeholder engagement. So it's not in some ways political enough. It's not doing enough with local people. Little openness of the management to ongoing practices, all resulting in strong opposition of some societal groups against the current management strategy of the area. Okay, so this is not exemplary of the type of relationships between science and politics we might want to imagine in an Anthropocene setting. But those of you familiar with developments within geography and STS will know that there are other forms of public engagement in science and technology that could have been deployed in this example. Wiebe Bijker, who's a Dutch sociologist of science, has looked at how this might be done differently in this context, but also in other large infrastructure development projects in the Netherlands. And they have quite a sophisticated way of doing public engagement in science and technology. Some of you will be aware of a project run by my colleague Sarah Watmore at Oxford, which looked at flood risk mapping and the idea of kind of competency groups and ways in which you could gather forms of expertise together to deliberate about the management of this. So there are examples out there that we might look to, at least in circumstances which are quite well resourced and where you don't have sort of strong livelihood conflicts that you might associate with this taking place in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where you could think about engaging science and politics in new and interesting ways. And many of you will have experience of working in that domain. Okay, so in some ways there's not much to be learned from this other than don't do it this way in this kind of particular case study. Okay, so just to begin to draw this together then, so what kind of lessons could we learn from this case study for the Anthropocene from the Oostvaardersplassen experiment? What we're getting initially is a very different account from some of the popular accounts of the Anthropocene that we see emerging from figures like Mark Linus and Alan Wiseman. People come across these books. So Wiseman has this nice thought experiment entitled The World Without Us, and he imagines what would happen if people disappeared, and he traces how the planet would recover or at least change in various ways. But there's a kind of residual, quite disguised but still there anti-humanism within this. The world without us for Wiseman would be quite a good thing, and the sooner we can bring it about, the better, almost, is kind of within that. And there's certainly strands of that within particularly forms of North American environmentalism that would quite like an apocalypse, and would quite like a decimation of the human population in order to allow nature to return. You'll be familiar with that kind of discourse. And that's sort of one extreme that we see emerging in discussions about the Anthropocene. The other, Mark Linus, who's a popular science writer based in the UK, talks about the opportunity presented by the Anthropocene for humans to assume their role as the god species. So this is the kind of Enlightenment promise. We will be able to finally discipline, control, rationalize, order the planet. He's very taken by the planetary boundaries framework, which provides a kind of quantitative assessment of what might be possible within the planet. And for him, he's very taken by, I guess, a kind of free market approaches to environmentalism, we might be able to come up with a new, better, more reasonable framework for managing the planet, kind of more modernization, more Enlightenment science. So these are kind of two extremes, slightly caricatured. What we're seeing at the Oostvaardersplassen is somewhere in between those. Okay, so it's not a kind of rejection of science, it's not a kind of return to some primeval nature, but nor is it an accelerated process of domestication, of control, of rationalization. There's some interesting, conceptually interesting things going on in the middle of those two. So for me, conservation can no longer make recourse to a found nature, and that's a fairly familiar argument to many of us in geography and elsewhere. The world is hybrid, so the world is fundamentally composed of entangled human, non-human relationships. Wildlife is everywhere. It's not just in the Serengeti. It's here in Cardiff. It's here in our bodies. It's all around us. We don't need that kind of binary geographical imagination that only values nature that's far away. The idea about non-equilibrium ecology is that multiple future natures are possible. Okay, so the past is a useful guide, but we shouldn't seek to recreate the paleoecology of the past. I mean, climate change gives us enough reason to think about the problems associated with that, but also that systems are chaotic, they're contingent, they change in different directions, and we need to think about management where humans are going to be part and parcel of decisions about what ecologies become in the future. Fundamentally, these should be open to deliberation, but with a sense that we're not actually going to be able to control what happens if we think about some of the scenarios around invasive species or non-native species. But there's a politics about multinaturalism, which is what this is talking about. No singular nature, multiple natures. If multiple future natures are possible, there's a politics about who gets to decide and who's going to benefit about how these things come into existence. So we need new ways of thinking about science that is speculative, that is in some ways anticipatory. So you're able to generate conditions in which surprises will emerge and then learn from them. Sea eagles coming and nesting below sea level, dead animals generating new ecologies of composition that wouldn't have been possible between a very orderly form of conservation management. And this will require very different forms of monitoring, forms of surveillance. It may well require new conservation territories. So we have a fairly well established in the UK real estate of conservation territories, SSSIs in particular. But it may well be that with climate change and with new ways of imagining ecological connectivity, they actually cease to be useful. Particularly if we want to think about connecting together these fragmented sites, maybe we need to think carefully about designating new areas and letting other areas go in that way. A sense that the existing territorial infrastructure might well be anachronistic for what's predicted to happen with these novel ecosystems. And of course, we need new techniques for public deliberation. And then some caveats. So what I'm saying here in many ways is the Anthropocene is likely to be a disaster for many forms of wildlife, particularly the kind of charismatic wildlife that figures so prominently in conservation programs. But it's also an opportunity we think about how conservation might adapt. Some of the risks of this, of course, is that we are very steeped in a certain idea of nature. There's a lot of political capital associated with nature, particularly in wider publics, and to abandon that is a risky endeavor. Not least because it leads to certain forms of environmental governance that would quite like to imagine multiple future fluid natures. So the UK government at the moment, in its wisdom, is very enthused about biodiversity offsetting, a kind of carbon offsetting mapped onto biodiversity that you could have. You could make everything exchangeable through a market-based system. So your badger is worth 7 otters and is worth 14 fritillary butterflies, and that somehow will generate a rational and well-organized system of saving nature conservation. This, I would say, is not in support of that model, but giving up on nature does lend certain kind of oxygen to that idea that Owen Paterson is promoting at the moment. And of course, giving up on nature and bringing science into politics loses that authority that science has in a kind of E.O. Wilson imagination to provide facts that politicians should just deal with. It very much requires new ways of thinking about deliberation that are complicated and expensive and fraught, but actually very much the status quo in terms of how decision-making works at the moment. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks.